For 20 years, the factory next door treated the strip along my fence like its personal dumping ground. Every few weeks, another load of rusted metal, broken machine parts, twisted steel, and forgotten equipment appeared as if my property line had become an extension of their waste yard. I complained to the factory. I documented everything with photos. I reported it to the HOA over and over again. Nothing changed. The piles only grew larger, and eventually everyone acted as though they had always belonged there. What no one could have imagined was that the very trash they had ignored for decades would one day become the reason my life changed forever. By the time the factory realized what had been hiding beneath those mountains of scrap, it was already too late. Their carelessness had created the biggest financial mistake they would ever make, and I was the one standing on the other side of it. My family had owned our property long before the surrounding land transformed into an upscale neighborhood governed by an HOA. My grandfather bought the acreage when the area was mostly open fields and small workshops. Back then, the factory was modest, employing local families and operating without much attention. As the years passed, the neighborhood expanded around it. New homes appeared, landscaped entrances replaced gravel roads, and eventually an HOA was established to maintain property values and enforce community standards. Our house wasn't the newest or the most expensive, but it was well cared for. The lawn was trimmed every week. The fence was repaired whenever storms damaged it. The flower beds were maintained, and every season I invested time keeping the property looking respectable. I believed that if I respected my home, my neighbors would respect it too. Unfortunately, respect wasn't something the factory seemed interested in giving. Their operations expanded year after year. More delivery trucks came through the gates, new storage buildings were constructed, and production increased. Around the same time, discarded materials started appearing near the fence separating our properties. At first, it was just a few pieces of rusted pipe or broken pallets. I assumed someone would eventually clean them up. Instead, the piles became permanent. Every month brought more debris. Bent steel beams, damaged machine housings, broken conveyor parts, crates filled with unusable hardware, heavy industrial scraps that no ordinary homeowner could move even if they wanted to. Before long, the entire length of the fence was bordered by an ugly wall of discarded equipment. The view from my backyard disappeared behind piles of rust. I contacted the factory countless times, expecting someone to acknowledge the problem. Sometimes they promised to look into it. Other times no one returned my calls at all. Weeks turned into months, and months became years. Eventually, I turned to the HOA, believing they would step in. After all, they constantly reminded homeowners about maintaining neighborhood appearance. They fined people over peeling paint, overgrown grass, and trash bins left outside too long. Surely an industrial dumping site visible from multiple homes would concern them. I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of addressing the source of the problem, the HOA would soon make me the target, and that decision would set off a chain of events none of them could control. The first warning letter from the HOA arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I expected it to be another reminder about a neighborhood meeting or a routine announcement. Instead, I opened an official notice accusing me of allowing my property to negatively affect the appearance of the community. The irony was impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't concerned about the massive piles of industrial waste sitting just beyond my fence. They weren't concerned about the trucks leaving debris behind or the factory using the edge of my property as an unofficial storage area. Somehow, the problem they had discovered was me. According to the notice, the visible scrap near my backyard was lowering the neighborhood's image. They demanded that I take corrective action to improve the appearance of the area. But there was one major problem. I didn't own the debris. I couldn't legally remove materials that belonged to another property owner, especially when some of it was heavy industrial equipment. I responded with photographs, dates, and copies of every complaint I had sent to the factory. I explained the situation clearly and asked why the HOA was targeting the homeowner affected by the problem instead of the company creating it. The response was frustratingly simple. They claimed the HOA was only responsible for enforcing community appearance rules and that disputes with neighboring businesses were outside their authority. Yet somehow, they had enough authority to issue me fines. Over the next several months, the pressure increased. More notices arrived. Then came monetary penalties for what they called failure to maintain acceptable property conditions. Each fine felt like another reminder that the people responsible for protecting the neighborhood had chosen the easiest target instead. I began keeping a detailed record of everything. Every letter, every photograph, every conversation. I created a timeline showing how long the factory had been leaving debris along the fence and how long the HOA had ignored my complaints. The more evidence I collected, the more questions I had. Why was the HOA so determined to blame me? Why had they never investigated the factory properly? And why did several board members seem uncomfortable whenever the topic came up? Then one day, while reviewing old property documents, I noticed something strange. The fence line everyone had accepted for decades might not have been the official boundary. It was a small detail hidden inside an old survey map. Most people would have overlooked it. Even I almost did. But the measurements didn't match what existed on the ground. The fence had been installed years before the current neighborhood was built. Over time, everyone assumed it marked the property division. The factory believed it. The HOA believed it. The previous owners believed it. But assumptions don't change legal ownership. I started comparing old records with county documents, historical maps, and property descriptions. Slowly, a shocking possibility began to appear. The factory might not have been dumping beside my property. They might have been dumping directly onto it. And if that was true, the pile of scrap everyone considered worthless wasn't just a neighbor's mess. It was evidence sitting on land that belonged to me. I couldn't stop thinking about what those records suggested. For years, everyone had looked at that fence as the dividing line between my property and the factory's land. But if the old survey was correct, that fence had been placed several feet inside my property decades earlier. That meant the factory hadn't simply been leaving scraps near my home. They had been placing them on land they didn't own. I knew I couldn't rely on assumptions, so I hired a professional surveyor to conduct a complete boundary investigation. The process took weeks. They reviewed original property deeds, archived county maps, construction plans, and historical aerial photographs. Every document added another piece to a puzzle that had been ignored for generations. When the final measurements were completed, the results confirmed what I had started to suspect. The disputed strip of land belonged to me. The news changed everything. Suddenly, the factory's casual dumping wasn't just a neighborhood complaint. It was a property rights issue. Every piece of equipment, every pile of metal, and every truckload of discarded material had been placed on private property without permission. I contacted legal experts and began the process of officially documenting the violation. The same evidence I had collected while fighting the HOA for years became the foundation of my case. The photographs they had dismissed became proof. The complaint records they ignored became a timeline showing how long the problem had existed. Then came the question nobody expected. What exactly was buried beneath those piles? For 2 decades, the factory had treated the scrap as worthless waste. But industrial materials change value over time. Old machinery parts, specialty metals, and equipment components that once had little value could become highly valuable depending on their composition, age, and condition. A professional inspection was arranged. The first layers revealed exactly what everyone expected: rust, broken parts, and damaged equipment. But as the cleanup continued, investigators discovered materials that were far more significant than ordinary scrap. Some pieces came from older manufacturing systems that were no longer produced. Others contained valuable industrial metals that had increased dramatically in price over the years. Equipment that had been abandoned as useless was now considered recoverable property. The factory's mistake was becoming clear. They had spent 20 years trying to hide an ugly problem behind my fence, never realizing they were creating a valuable record of their own negligence. Meanwhile, the HOA started facing questions from other residents. Homeowners wanted to know why they had received strict enforcement letters for minor issues, while a major property dispute had been ignored for years. The board members who once acted confident suddenly had very few answers. But the biggest shock was still coming. Because once the full value of what had been dumped on my land was calculated, nobody, not the factory, not the HOA, and not even me, was prepared for the number that appeared on the final report. The final valuation report changed the entire situation. What started as a simple property dispute had become something much larger. The materials sitting behind my fence for 20 years were no longer just an eyesore. They represented decades of unauthorized use of my land, potential environmental concerns, and a financial liability the factory could no longer ignore. The factory's first reaction was disbelief. For years, they had operated under the assumption that the narrow strip of land belonged to them. They believed the fence was the boundary. They believed the scrap was their responsibility to leave there. They believed no one would ever challenge what had become routine. But documents don't care about assumptions. The official survey, property records, and historical evidence told a completely different story. Once attorneys became involved, the factory's position weakened quickly. The evidence showed that they had benefited from using my property as an unofficial storage area while avoiding the costs of proper disposal. Every complaint I had filed became another piece of evidence showing that the issue had been known but ignored. The HOA also found itself under pressure. Residents who had watched me receive fines and warnings wanted explanations. They questioned why the association had focused on controlling homeowners while ignoring a much larger issue affecting the community's appearance and property values. The same board members who once treated my complaints as insignificant were now forced to answer uncomfortable questions in front of the neighborhood. The turning point came when independent assessments confirmed the value of the recovered materials, the property damages, and the long-term impact of the unauthorized dumping. The numbers were far beyond what anyone expected. The factory had viewed the scrap as a problem to forget. It had accidentally created an asset sitting on someone else's land. Negotiations began, and the company quickly realized fighting the case could cost far more than resolving it. They agreed to cover the cleanup, compensate for the years of unauthorized use, and recognize my rights as the legal owner of the land where the materials had been stored. What had started with ignored complaints and unfair HOA penalties ended with the very evidence they overlooked becoming the reason they had to answer for everything. The piles of rusted metal that once made me feel powerless had become the strongest proof that patience, documentation, and persistence mattered. But the final outcome would reveal the biggest lesson of all. Sometimes the things people ignore for years are exactly the things that hold the greatest value. The settlement brought an end to a battle that had lasted far longer than anyone expected. After years of unanswered complaints, unfair treatment, and constant frustration, the situation was finally resolved in a way that changed everything. The factory accepted responsibility for the unauthorized use of my property. They paid for the complete removal of the debris, covered the damages caused by years of dumping, and reached an agreement that recognized the value of the materials recovered from my land. What had once been a neglected corner of property became the reason my family's financial future was completely transformed. But the impact went far beyond money. The HOA was forced to face the consequences of how it handled the situation. Homeowners who had watched the conflict unfold demanded accountability. They wanted to know why the association had been so aggressive towards small violations while ignoring a major issue happening right in the community. The old leadership lost the trust of many residents. New board members promised more transparency, better communication, and fairer enforcement of neighborhood rules. The experience became a reminder that an organization created to protect a community can lose its purpose when power is used without responsibility. The factory also changed its approach. New procedures were put in place to prevent future mistakes, property boundaries were reviewed, and waste management practices were updated. A problem that had been ignored for 2 decades forced them to make changes that should have happened long before. As for me, I never forgot how this all began. For years, I looked at that pile of scrap as a symbol of everything that was unfair. It represented the complaints nobody answered, the fines I didn't deserve, and the feeling that powerful organizations could simply ignore ordinary people. But in the end, that same pile became the evidence that proved the truth. The land everyone overlooked had value. The materials everyone dismissed had worth. And the problem everyone refused to solve became the opportunity that changed my life. The biggest lesson I learned was simple. Never assume something is worthless just because others don't see its value. Sometimes the things people ignore, abandon, or throw away are hiding opportunities waiting for someone willing to look closer. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who discovers the truth that changes everything.